October 14th, 2001. Gene Hackman is sitting in front of 300 drama students at the new school in Manhattan. James Lipton leans forward and asks a simple question about his childhood. What happened next made the entire room go silent. A 71-year-old man, two-time Academy Award winner, one of the most respected actors in Hollywood history, started to cry. And when he finally spoke, his voice broke on words he had been carrying for 58 years. That moment would be replayed millions of times after his death, and it revealed something about Gene Hackman that no film role ever could. The wound that made him who he was. The interview had been going well. Hackman was relaxed, telling stories about his early career, cracking jokes that made the students laugh. He talked about being voted least likely to succeed at the Pasadena Playhouse alongside Dustin Hoffman. He talked about the struggle, the rejection, the years of wondering if he would ever make it. Then Lipton shifted the conversation. "How old were you when your father left?" The room went quiet. Something changed in Hackman's face. The easy confidence disappeared. His jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands. "About 13, I guess." Lipton waited. The students waited. 300 people holding their breath. "It was tough," Hackman said quietly. Lipton pressed gently. "I understand it was a particularly casual goodbye." Hackman nodded slowly. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, like he was 13 years old again. "I was down the street, playing with some guys, and he drove by and kind of waved." He stopped. His hand came up to his face. His eyes were wet. "Excuse me," he said. The silence in that room was absolute. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. They were watching one of the toughest actors in Hollywood crumble in front of them. Hackman cleared his throat, tried to smile. "It's only been 65 years or so." The audience laughed nervously, but Hackman wasn't joking. Not really. Lipton asked softly, "It's not something that goes away easily, is it?" Hackman shook his head. "It probably makes you a better actor. I don't know." He paused, gathering himself. "You get in touch with your feelings, and that's what we're here for. I think the more you can draw on that kind of thing, get something out of it. Get something out of it." Those 4 words contain the entire story of Gene Hackman's life. But to understand what that wave really cost him, you need to go back to a Saturday morning in Danville, Illinois, in 1943. It was summer, the kind of morning that should have been ordinary. Gene Hackman was 13 years old, playing in his friend's front yard on the east side of town. The sun was out. The air smelled like cut grass and coal smoke from the train tracks that ran behind his grandmother's house. A few kids were tossing a ball around. Gene was laughing at something. Then he heard a car engine. Gene looked up just as his father's car came down the street. His father, Eugene Ezra Hackman, was behind the wheel. The car was moving slowly. Their eyes met through the windshield. His father raised his hand. Not a big wave, just a small gesture. A casual flip of the wrist, the kind of wave you might give to a stranger on the street. Gene stood frozen in the yard. The ball rolled past his feet. His friend was saying something, but Gene couldn't hear the words. All he could hear was the sound of that engine fading into the distance. "That wave," Hackman would say decades later. It was like he was saying, "Okay, it's all yours. You're on your own, kiddo." Gene knew in that instant. He didn't know how he knew, but he knew. His father was not coming back. He walked home slowly. His legs felt heavy. When he opened the front door, his mother Anna was sitting at the kitchen table. Her eyes were red. An empty glass sat in front of her. She looked at her son and didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Gene went upstairs to his room and closed the door. He sat on his bed and stared at the wall. He didn't cry. He felt something worse than tears. He felt hollow, like someone had reached inside him and scooped out everything that mattered. The Hackman household had never been happy. Eugene Sr. worked as a pressman for the Commercial News, the local newspaper. It was dirty work. He came home every night with oil grit under his fingernails and ink stains on his coveralls. His own father and brother were reporters for the same paper, white-collar men who worked upstairs in suits. Eugene was always conscious of the difference, always aware that he was the one who worked with his hands while his family worked with their minds. That awareness made him angry, and when Eugene Hackman got angry, he used his fists. His parents fought repeatedly, one biographer wrote, and his father often used his fists on Gene to take out his rage. Gene learned to read the signs. When his father's jaw got tight, it was time to disappear. When his mother's voice got high and brittle, it was time to go outside. He learned to make himself small, invisible, out of the way, but nothing prepared him for that wave. It was a real adios, Hackman told Vanity Fair in 2004. It was so precise. Maybe that's why I became an actor. I doubt I would have become so sensitive to human behavior if that hadn't happened to me as a child, if I hadn't realized how much one small gesture can mean. One small gesture, a flip of the wrist, less than a second, and it broke something in Gene Hackman that never fully healed. After his father left, Gene's mother, Anna, fell apart. She had always been a drinker, but now the drinking became constant. She and her mother, Beatrice, in whose house they lived, fought constantly. The house that had been tense before became unbearable. Gene started acting out, getting into fights at school, talking back to teachers, rebelling against any authority that tried to tell him what to do. I became a punk, Hackman admitted later. I have trouble with authority. I always have. He spent his Saturday afternoons at the Palace Theater in downtown Danville, losing himself in the darkness. He watched Errol Flynn and James Cagney on screen, men who looked strong and fearless and in control, men whose fathers didn't abandon them, men who mattered. One day, walking out of the palace, Gene caught his reflection in the big gilt mirror near the entrance. He saw a rumpled, potato-faced boy with nothing special about him. Not handsome like Errol Flynn, not tough like James Cagney, just ordinary. He thought, I could never be like them. But another thought followed. Maybe I could pretend. 3 years after his father left, Gene made a decision. He was 16 years old. He had had enough of Danville, enough of his mother's drinking, enough of the memories. He went to the Marine Corps recruiting office and lied about his age. Told them he was 17. They didn't check too carefully. I suddenly got the itch to get out, Hackman recalled. He served 4.5 years as a field radio operator, stationed in China and Japan. He was constantly running afoul of officers. He got demoted more times than he could count. I had trouble with anyone telling me what to do, he said. The same rebellion that had gotten him in trouble in Danville followed him into the military, and underneath that rebellion was the same wound, the same anger at a father who had waved goodbye and never looked back. After the Marines, Gene drifted. He came back to Danville briefly, worked as a cameraman at the local TV station. But he couldn't stay. The town was too small, the memories too big. He ended up in New York, taking odd jobs. Doorman, furniture mover, shoe salesman, truck driver. He lived in cockroach-infested apartments with no heat. One evening, Gene was working as a doorman at a restaurant in Times Square when his old Marine sergeant happened to walk by. The sergeant looked Hackman up and down and saw the same anger, the same lack of confidence Gene had shown in the military. "Hackman," the sergeant sneered, "you're a sorry SOB." Something clicked. Gene Hackman decided to become an actor. He enrolled at the Pasadena Playhouse at age 30. Most of his classmates were teenagers. One of them was a skinny young guy named Dustin Hoffman. At the end of the program, the faculty voted Hackman and Hoffman least likely to succeed. That rejection should have destroyed him. Instead, it made him angrier. The same anger he had felt watching his father drive away. The same anger that had burned inside him for 17 years. I'll show them, Gene thought. I'll show all of them. It took years, more rejection, more struggle, more days when he thought about giving up. But in 1967, Warren Beatty cast him as Buck Barrow in Bonnie and Clyde, his first Oscar nomination. 4 years later, he won Best Actor for The French Connection. When his name was announced, Gene Hackman walked to the stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. He was 41 years old. He had spent 28 years carrying the wound his father gave him. He thought about that wave. He thought about the 13-year-old boy standing frozen in the yard, watching his world end. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought, "Are you watching this, old man? Do you see what I became?" Gene Hackman's mother never saw him act. In 1962, a few years before his career finally took off, Anna Lyda Hackman died in a fire in her home. The fire was started by a lit cigarette. She had been drinking, passed out, and the cigarette had fallen from her hand. Gene was in New York when he got the call. He flew back to Danville for the funeral, stood at her graveside, felt the weight of everything unsaid. "Unfortunately, my mom never saw me act," Hackman said years later. "So I'm sorry for that, but that's the way it is." The one film he wished she could have seen was I Never Sang for My Father. He played Gene, a man struggling to connect with his dying father, a man trying to repair a relationship that had been broken for decades. "I thought it was a sensitive picture about family and relationships," Hackman said. "I think she would have been proud and happy to see that." His father lived longer, long enough to see Gene become a star. "I buried the hatchet before he died," Hackman said once, but he never said more than that. Whatever passed between them in those final meetings, Hackman kept it to himself. In 1971, after Gene won his Oscar for The French Connection, he returned to Danville for a family visit. A photograph from that trip shows something remarkable. Gene Hackman, now a famous movie star, standing next to his father at the Commercial News Building. Eugene Sr., the man who had waved goodbye and driven away 28 years earlier, was giving his son a tour of the printing press where he still worked. They look like strangers in the photograph. Two men standing side by side with nothing to say. Some wounds you carry to the grave. The clip from inside the actor's studio went viral after Gene Hackman's death in February 2025. Millions of people watched a 71-year-old man break down while talking about something that happened when he was 13. The comments poured in. "This destroyed me. 65 years and it still hurts." That's what abandonment does. Now I understand why he was so good at playing broken men. A student who was in the audience that night in 2001 posted her memory of the moment. When he started crying, you could have heard a pin drop. Here was this tough guy, this legend, and he was just shattered. I've never forgotten it. I think about it every time I see one of his films now. James Lipton, in a later interview, reflected on that moment. Gene Hackman was one of the most prepared, most professional actors I ever interviewed. He had an answer for everything. But when I asked about his father, all of that armor fell away. For a moment, he wasn't Gene Hackman, the movie star. He was a little boy who had been left behind. Gene Hackman died in February 2025 at the age of 95. He had not made a film in over 20 years. He had not given an interview in nearly as long. He had simply disappeared to Santa Fe, New Mexico, far from Hollywood, far from the spotlight. Some said he was tired. Some said he was bitter about the business. But those who knew the real story understood something else. Gene Hackman had spent his entire career turning pain into art. He had channeled the abandonment, the anger, the hollow feeling of watching his father wave goodbye into performances that made him one of the greatest actors of his generation. Popeye Doyle's rage in The French Connection, the desperate father in I Never Sang for My Father, the ruthless control of Little Bill in Unforgiven, Royal Tenenbaum, the father who abandoned his own family and spent the rest of his life trying to make up for it. All of them were Gene Hackman. All of them were that 13-year-old boy still trying to understand why he wasn't enough. "Maybe that's why I became an actor," Hackman said. "I doubt I would have become so sensitive to human behavior if that hadn't happened to me as a child." The wave his father gave him was meant to be an ending, a dismissal, a goodbye. Gene Hackman turned it into everything. 2 Academy Awards, over 80 films, a legacy that will be studied for generations. But underneath all of that, underneath the fame and the respect and the legend, there was always a boy in a front yard in Danville, Illinois. A boy watching his father's car disappear around the corner. A boy who never stopped wondering why. In the final moments of that Inside the Actor Studio interview, after Hackman had composed himself, Lipton asked his famous questionnaire. One of the questions was, "What sound or noise do you hate?" Hackman thought for a moment. "The sound of a car driving away," he said. The audience didn't laugh. They understood. Some sounds stay with you forever. Gene Hackman heard that sound on a Saturday morning in 1943. He heard it every day for the next 82 years, and he turned it into art. That's not just talent, that's survival. That's taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and refusing to let it destroy you. That's Gene Hackman, the boy who was left behind, the man who proved he mattered. One wave, one wound, one extraordinary life.